Good evening. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you. I believe that you belong to a book club. What a delightful idea. I confess that nowadays there are few books that interest me. My own stories are little read these days. I'm told the young people think them too goody-goody and churchy. And yet The Heir of Redcliffe was the most popular novel of its day. I confess my strength is not what it once was. So I have invited some other ladies to join us this evening. For me, writing began as simple amusement. Soon it became an irresistible temptation, but it was only justified if it served a higher end. I was always guided by my father's ideals, like Miss Maria Edgeworth, whose early works were interpretations of her father's thoughts. Am I correct, Miss Edgeworth?
Indeed you are. When I began a 6-volume novel, my father suggested that instead I should write simple moral tales for children. I was surprised by their success.
And next, allow me to present Miss Fanny Burney.
Countess D'Arblay, if you please. But we are among friends, and I'm remembered most as Fanny Burney.
Oh, I beg your pardon. I have never outgrown my ungracious shyness, and it has stood in the way of many introductions.
Then let me introduce myself. I am Jane Austen.
Oh, Miss Austen, I could not have written anything without the inspiration of your work.
Thank you, Miss Young. Let us favour each other with our lives and adventures. Madame D'Arblay, Miss Burney, you are the first of us, and your rank gives you precedence. Will you begin?
Gladly. I was born in 1752 in Norfolk, and my mother died when I was 10. I was never more than passably good-looking, very slight and short-sighted. I was shy and prim, and visitors used to call me the old lady.
I was born in 1768 in Oxfordshire, but brought up in Ireland. My father declared that I was exactly in the middle ground between beauty and plainness. Nowadays, nobody is ugly but myself.
I was born in Hampshire in 1775. My mother, who was often ailing, outlived me by 10 years and died at the age of 87. My nephew, Edward Austenleigh, claims I was tall and slender, and my countenance had a peculiar charm of its own. But does he say that I was handsome? No. Or plain? No, he does not.
I was born in 1823 in Otterbourne in Hampshire. I really never knew whether or not I was ugly. Once I asked my mother if I was pretty, and she replied that all young animals, even pigs, are pretty.
I had 4 brothers, but the most important person in my life was my sister, Cassandra.
Oh, Susan, my elder sister, was my dearest and closest comrade in every thought and feeling.
I had only one younger brother, poor Julian. So I wrote stories for the pleasure of living, as it were, with large imaginary families.
Perhaps you were blessed. My father married 4 times and had 22 children, many of whom did not survive.
Oh, well, my father, a celebrated musician, employed me in copying his manuscripts. But I contrived to scribble a good deal on my own account too. But my stepmother considered that literary composition was not becoming to a young lady. So when I was 15, I made a bonfire of my writings as a sacrifice to her opinions.
The opinions of a stepmother. You had only one, I had 3. The last stepmother was younger than I, and they all had their opinions. A friend of mine was acquainted with you, Miss Burney, and I was always begging her to tell me all about you. I felt that if I could only meet you, I would be completely happy. I wrote to you, but received no response.
Well, I am glad that we meet at last, Miss Edgeworth.
Education, my own and that of others, has always been the greatest part of my life. May I learn of yours, Miss Burney?
Oh, I had very little education. One of my brothers went to school and the other to sea. Because of their superior appearance and intelligence, my 2 sisters were sent to school in Paris. But I had no governess and no teacher. My dear sister Susan showed me how to write, and I soon found pleasure in reading. My father's library was large, but contained only one novel, Fielding's Amelia.
We were a reading family. My father's library contained more than 500 books. We read Dr. Johnson and the novels of Fielding and Richardson, and we all enjoyed your works, Miss Burnley and Miss Edgeworth.
My parents became enthusiastic for a new system of natural education based on Rousseau. My older brother was left to roam freely, but he became ungovernable and had to be sent away to sea. I was largely ignored. I relieved my feelings of unhappiness by trampling on the frames in our walled garden and revelling in the delightful sound of breaking glass.
I was certainly not spoilt. My parents repressed me when I was troublesome, allowed few indulgences in eating and drinking, and I had no holidays. A schoolroom was added to our house where my mother taught me from 10 till 1. And when my brother Julian was 5 and I was 11, father began to teach us Latin and arithmetic. He used to wake at 6, and I worked with him for an hour before breakfast on Greek, Euclid and algebra. He required a diligence and accuracy that were utterly alien to me and often reduced me to tears. And yet I believe that no one ever had a happier childhood than mine.
When I was 12, I was sent to a fashionable boarding school in London, but I had no aptitude for music or drawing or dancing. My stepmother, the first one, hoped that by learning to dance I might alter my method of holding myself, which she said wanted great improvement.
My sister Cassandra and I were sent to school in Southampton, but we caught typhus and I nearly died. The greater part of my education was provided within my family. So I think I may boast myself to be, with all possible vanity, the most unlearned and uninformed female who ever dared to be an authoress.
Miss Burney, you were a bridge for later writers, from the novels of Richardson and Fielding, and yours, Miss Austen, and I do believe you were a friend of Dr. Samuel Johnson.
Oh, well, I had that honour. He called me my dear little Burney. When I wrote my first novel, Evelina, I shared it with my sister Susan and my brother Charles, who found a publisher who gave me £21 for the manuscript. Oh, I was determined to remain anonymous and dreaded being discovered as the author. I feared the horror of personal abuse, but the response was favourable. One critic said that Evelina was frankly entertaining and agreeable.
I met a young man from Oxford who heard that Evelina was written by Dr. Johnson.
Oh, when I revised my second novel, Cecilia, he retouched the style of many of the passages.
To their disadvantage, I believe. But I am an admirer of Dr. Johnson. He understood that to invent a story requires a large effort of human understanding. But advice and interference, however well-intentioned, is not always helpful to a young writer.
Well, certainly Cecilia did not succeed as well with the public as Evelina.
Well, you had the help of the dogmatic doctor.
Well, the playwright in Cheriton encouraged me to write a comedy, but my father did not think it appropriate for a young lady to write for the theatre.
I wrote The Absentee as a play for our young audience. My father insisted on sending it to Sheridan, who refused it on the grounds that it would not appeal to an English audience. So I turned it into a novel.
I wrote a Christmas play for children. They say that even great novelists cannot succeed in the drama, so I may have made a fine mess of it.
When I was very young, I enjoyed writing foolish little plays, and my family enjoyed reading them aloud.
Oh, every evening my father used to hear me read what I had written in the day, and he would criticise and alter my expressions. At last I found it impossible to write in such fetters, and laid my work aside to be rewritten later on.
My father always encouraged my efforts. My precious portable writing desk was a gift from him. He was certain that I would one day be a published author, and in 1797, when I was 22, he approached a London publisher with the manuscript of First Impressions. It eventually appeared in 1813 as Pride and Prejudice.
My most successful novel was The Heir of Redcliffe. After he had corrected the language and polished up the sentences, My father offered the manuscript to Mr. Murray, who declined it. It was passed on to the firm of Mr. John Parker and published in 1853.
I am as fond of novels as you can be, but I'm afraid that they act on the constitution of the mind as drink does on the body. I found the plot of Pride and Prejudice rather racy.
Indeed. My brother Henry learned that the Prince Regent was an admirer of my work and kept a set in each of his residences. I was given permission to dedicate Emma to him.
After my first novel, Castle Rackrent, was published, I heard that King George had read it. It seems he rubbed his hands and said, what, now I know something of my Irish subjects.
His Majesty's voice. When I met him in 1785, we spoke of Shakespeare. His Majesty said, "Was there ever such stuff? What think you? Is it not sad stuff? What? But one must not say so. It's Shakespeare, and no one dare abuse him."
At first, no one outside my family knew I was the author of Sense and Sensibility, my first novel. It earned me £140.
Before I published my first book, there was an understanding in the family that I would not take the money for it myself. Instead, it would be used for good work. It was thought unladylike to benefit financially from one's writing.
What would you have done if you'd been forbidden to publish, Miss Yonge?
I would have gone on writing, but never published. At least, not for many years.
I was such an admirer of your novels, Miss Edgeworth, that I sent you all 3 volumes of Emma anonymously.
Oh, only the first volume reached me. I thought there was very little story in it.
So Walter Scott thought Emma was part of a new trend in fiction, drawing characters and incidents from ordinary life.
It's better not to be too eager for reviews, or to pin one's feelings on them. Charlotte Bronte cried all night over what was said of Jane Eyre, and George Eliot was not allowed to see unfavourable criticism, so any chance of improvement was missed.
When we began to read Mansfield Park in 1814, we found it entertaining and very like real life. I liked it all, except for the prosings of the conclusion.
Sweet flattery. I am read and admired in Ireland. Perhaps I may marry your son, Miss Burney, the young Mr. D'Arblay.
You joke, Miss Austen. Alexandra is but 20 years old.
You are the only one of us who married, Miss Burney. And to a Frenchman, General D'Arblay. That shows some daring.
Oh, I was touched by his situation. A penniless émigré, driven from France by the Révolution. My father disapproved of the match. He thought him a mere soldier of fortune, but we married in spite of his concerns.
When I received a proposal of marriage from a family friend, Mr. Harris Big Withers, I accepted him. But after a night of reflection, I changed my mind. Anything is to be endured rather than marrying without affection.
I was amused when an Italian newspaper announced that Queen Victoria had made me a Viscountess, and I had married the British ambassador in Constantinople. In truth, I have had much affection in my life. I found happiness in my family, my community, and my novels.
Novels can display the greatest powers of the mind, the most thorough knowledge of human nature, and the liveliest effusions of wit in the best language. But pictures of perfection make me feel sick and wicked.
In 1818, I read Northanger Abbey and found it one of the most stupid, nonsensical fictions I've ever read. It's not worth a moment's consideration. Yet many people prefer it to Persuasion, but none in my household, thank heavens. Persuasion seems exceedingly interesting and natural. The lovers are so well drawn that we feel it's quite real.
People used to tell us that we had too many books to care about them, but I'm sure we cared heartily for our favourites. Sir Walter Scott, above all. I was allowed a chapter a day of the Waverley novels, provided I first read 20 pages of Goldsmith's Rome or some equally solid book.
We read Waverley aloud, and it seized the feelings of young and old. But we could not endure the occasional addresses to the reader. We just couldn't bear them.
But Walter Scott has no business to write novels, especially good ones. It's not fair. He has fame and profit enough as a poet, and he should not take the bread out of other people's mouths. I do not mean to like Waverley, if I can help it, but I fear I must.
Sir Walter and I exchanged letters, and in 1823 I took my 2 nieces on a tour of Scotland in order to meet him. We stayed with him in his Gothic castle. It was the highlight of my life.
Oh, what happiness! I may respect, admire, rely on other authors more, but my primary literary affection must ever be for Sir Walter.
Our pleasures in literature do not, I think, decline with age. The 1st of January was my 82nd birthday, and I think I had as much enjoyment from books as ever I had in my life. Which of our books are still read today, I wonder?
Well, rather than tell this august company, I have had a better idea. The assembled company is, I understand, a very learned group of ladies and gentlemen. We should ask them. Who remembers any of Fanny Burney's books? Or what have you read? Please tell us.
Well, I've just read Fanny Burney's diaries.
Ah,
I've been
you.
told off for calling you Fanny when it should be Frances.
Oh,
Indeed, well, thank you. And of course, turning to Miss Edgeworth.
Yes, does anyone recall any of mine?
Castle Rathbone.
Oh,
I have a large collection of
Oh,
Maria Edgeworth books.
I'm greatly honoured.
Yes. And we can't forget Belinda and the modern Griselda, Leonora, the absentee, patronage.
Indeed. And how about my friend Miss Austen? I'm sure we can recall 1 or 2 of her.
There are marvellous. I'm greatly relieved. But of course, who remembers some of Miss Young's work? I mean, there are plenty to remember.
there were so many.
Please shout out.
Yeah, I've read them.
Yes.
Heartsease.
Yes.
2 sides of the shield.
Wonderful. Well,
Young stepmother.
yes. Yes, well done. I mean, we could be here all night if we... And besides, I think something possibly might be to explode over there. So we will... We will now just say, and now, good night, ladies.
Good night, sweet ladies and gentlemen.
Good night.
Good night.